They say the dust of that land remembers everything. It holds the memory of every tear that fell without a sound, every drop of blood that stained the cracked earth, and every whispered prayer the wind carried away to nowhere. It remembers the heat of the auction block, the glint of coin in a cruel man's hand, and the hollowed-out look of a soul being sold. And it remembers the day the silence was broken by a man who bought a life not for labor, but for something no one there could understand. The auctioneer's voice was a gravelly rasp, worn coarse by years of hawking human misery. He spat tobacco juice, a brown stain that sizzled on the sun-scorched planks of the platform. One by one, they were sold. Men with backs scarred into maps of suffering, women whose hands were rough as bark but whose eyes still held a flicker of fight. Then came the pregnant ones. They were paraded as a grim sort of bargain, a 2-for-1 deal for the most ambitious and least humane of buyers. They sold quickly, their swollen bellies a mark of future assets. All but one. She was the last. Her name was Serafina, though no one there used it. To them, she was merely the final lot, an inconvenience standing between them and their midday meal. She stood with a stillness that was not submission, but a kind of fierce, internal retreat. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, a hazy line where the pale, unforgiving sky met the endless, thirsty plain. Her hands rested over the swell of her belly, a gesture both protective and defiant. The auctioneer sneered. "What's the matter, gentlemen? Lost your appetite? A bit further along than the others, but the stock is strong. Good for another decade of work after she's dropped the whelp." A low, guttural laugh rippled through the small crowd of buyers. They were land barons and overseers, men whose hearts were as hard and barren as the ground they owned. But they hesitated. She was too close to her time. A risk. She would be useless for months, a mouth to feed with no return. The auctioneer grew impatient, his face reddening under the relentless sun. "Fine. Let's start the bidding low. A pittance, just to get her off my hands." Silence. The only sound was the buzz of flies and the nervous shuffle of boots in the dust. Serafina did not flinch. Her pride was a shield, thin as glass but a shield nonetheless. Inside, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She prayed to a god she wasn't sure was listening anymore, a desperate, wordless plea for the child who knew nothing of this world but the steady rhythm of her fear. And then, a voice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a bid, not in the way the others had been shouted. It was a statement, calm and clear, cutting through the heavy, stagnant air. $100. Every head turned. He stood at the edge of the crowd, a man who did not belong. He was not dressed like a wealthy landowner, his clothes were worn, patched but clean. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed a face that seemed carved from weathered oak, all hard plains and quiet sorrow. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were fixed on Serafina. Not on her belly, not with the calculating gaze of the others, but on her face. It was as if he saw not a commodity, but the woman standing there. The auctioneer blinked, stunned. 100. He laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. Sold. To the stranger in the back. The gavel cracked down, the sound unnaturally loud, a final, brutal punctuation mark. The transaction was swift. The man, Elias, they would learn was his name, paid in worn bills, his movements deliberate. He didn't look at the auctioneer. He didn't look at the other buyers who were now staring, whispering amongst themselves. He walked to the platform, his steps even and measured. He did not reach for her arm or a rope. He simply stood before her and waited. His gaze was unreadable, but it held no malice. Serafina's fear was a cold stone in her stomach, but for the first time that day, a sliver of something else pierced through it, confusion. He gestured with his head toward a wagon hitched nearby. He said. The word was so alien in that place, so foreign on the tongue of a man who had just bought her, that she thought she must have misheard. He said nothing more. He turned and walked to his wagon, expecting her to follow. She did. Each step was a plunge into an unknown darker and more terrifying than the life she had known. At least that life, in all its horror, was familiar. This was a void. The journey was made in a silence as vast and empty as the landscape they moved through. The wagon wheels groaned, a constant complaint against the ruts in the dry road. The sun beat down. Elias sat straight-backed, his hands holding the reins with a steady, capable grip. He never looked at her, but she felt his awareness of her, a palpable presence beside him. She huddled in the corner of the wagon bed, her arms wrapped around herself, a fortress against the world. She watched him, studying the rigid set of his jaw, the deep lines etched around his eyes. He was a man haunted by something. She knew the look. She had seen it in the mirror. Who was this man? A farmer? His hand suggested it. A madman? His actions at the auction suggested that, too. Or something else entirely, something for which she had no name. Her mind raced, creating 1,000 terrible scenarios. But his silence was a blank wall she could not see beyond. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, he finally pulled the wagon to a halt. He got down, his movements stiff from the long ride, and built a small fire. He shared his meager meal with her, a piece of hardtack and dried meat, placing it on a clean cloth near her without a word. He then took out a small block of wood and a knife and began to carve. His hands, which had looked so powerful on the reins, moved with a surprising delicacy. He was carving a bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. The focus in his eyes was absolute, a brief respite from the sorrow that seemed to permanently reside there. Serafina ate, the food tasting like ash in her mouth, but she knew she had to eat for the baby. She watched his knife peel away slivers of wood, and in the flickering firelight, she saw not a master, but a man as lost and lonely as she was. The fear remained, a constant, cold companion, but it was joined by a single, terrifying seed of hope. It was a foolish, dangerous thing to feel, but it had been planted nonetheless, there in the vast, silent dark of the plains. The farm was little more than a scar on the face of the prairie. A small, sturdy house built of sun-bleached timber, a solid barn, and a handful of cultivated acres wrestled from the unforgiving earth. It was a place of profound solitude. As the wagon pulled up, a boy of about 7 emerged from the house, wiping his nose on his sleeve. He had the same stormy eyes as Elias, the same quiet solemnity, but his face was smudged with dirt and a child's open-hearted grief. He stopped short when he saw Serafina, his eyes widening with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Elias climbed down from the wagon, his body moving with a weariness that went bone-deep. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Caleb," he said, his voice softer than Serafina had yet heard it. This is a guest." The boy, Caleb, just stared. Elias offered a hand to Serafina to help her down. She hesitated for a long moment, her body tense. His hand was calloused and strong, but his touch was unexpectedly gentle. She allowed him to help her to the ground, her feet sinking into the soft dust of the yard. She felt impossibly fragile, exposed under the boy's unwavering gaze. She expected orders, a list of chores, a stern delineation of her new servitude. Instead, Elias led her to the front door of the small house. It was clean inside. Scrupulously so. The main room held a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a small cot where the boy clearly slept. Everything was spare, functional, and tinged with an air of masculine melancholy. There were no feminine touches, no curtains on the windows, no flowers in a vase. Just the bare necessities of a life lived without softness. Elias walked to a closed door at the far end of the room. He opened it. Inside was another small room, containing a simple bed with a clean, patched quilt, a small washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a single, unadorned window that looked out over the fields. "This is yours," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, iron key. He placed it in her hand. The door locks from the inside. Serafina stared at the key resting in her palm. It was heavy, real. A key. The symbol of its power, of the choice it represented, was so overwhelming she felt her knees weaken. In her entire life, she had never had a door she could lock. A space that was hers alone. She looked up at him, her throat tight with 1,000 unasked questions. Why? What did he want from her? Elias seemed to read the turmoil in her face. His own was a mask of strained neutrality. "You are a guest here," he repeated, the words still sounding strange and formal. "You are safe. No one will harm you." He turned to his son. "Caleb, fetch some water for the lady." Caleb, who had been watching the entire exchange with a child's intense focus, scurried to obey. Seraphina stood in the doorway of her room, the key clutched in her hand, watching the man and his boy. It made no sense. This quiet kindness, this offer of sanctuary, was more disorienting than any cruelty would have been. Cruelty, she understood. This, she did not. The first days passed in a haze of unspoken tension. A new rhythm established itself, fragile and uncertain. Elias and Caleb would rise before dawn, their movements quiet so as not to disturb her. They would work the fields until dusk, their figures small and determined against the vast landscape. Seraphina would emerge from her room into the quiet house. At first, she did little, too consumed by suspicion and fear to move. But the ingrained habits of a lifetime were hard to break. She found herself cleaning the already clean house, her hands kneading the simple, repetitive motions. She found flour and yeast and baked bread, the warm, comforting smell filling the sterile air of the cabin for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She would leave the fresh loaf on the table, and when Elias and Caleb returned, they would eat it in their customary silence. But she saw the flicker of surprise in Elias's eyes, the small, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. He never commanded her to do anything. But when she mended a tear in Caleb's shirt, leaving it folded neatly on his cot, the next morning she found a basket of fresh vegetables from the garden sitting outside her door. It was a language of gestures, a conversation held through quiet acts of service and provision. She cooked. He provided. She mended. He repaired a loose floorboard near her room. A silent, careful dance of cohabitation began. The boy, Caleb, was the unwitting bridge between their two islands of solitude. He was a watcher, like his father, but his curiosity was untainted by adult sorrow. He would leave small treasures for her on the porch, a uniquely shaped stone, a bird's feather, a handful of wildflowers. He never spoke to her directly, but his offerings were a child's attempt at connection. One afternoon, she was sitting on the porch steps, shelling peas, when Caleb approached, clutching something in his hand. He held it out to her. It was the small wooden bird she had seen Elias carving by the firelight on their journey. Its tiny wings were sanded smooth, the grain of the wood warm from the boy's hand. She took it, her fingers tracing its delicate shape. "My mother, she liked birds," Caleb whispered, his first words to her. Seraphina's heart ached. She looked at the boy, at his sad, old eyes, and saw a grief that mirrored her own. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice husky. "Your father is a very skilled man." Caleb nodded, then pointed toward the fields where Elias was guiding the plow. "He doesn't talk much," the boy said, a simple statement of fact. Since she went away, and with that, a piece of the puzzle of Elias clicked into place. He was a widower. This stark, lonely life was the aftermath of a great loss. He wasn't just a quiet man, he was a man hollowed out by grief. That evening, as Elias sat at the table, cleaning his tools, Seraphina brought him a cup of hot tea. She set it down before him. Their hands brushed for a fraction of a second. A jolt, small but potent, passed between them. He looked up, his stormy eyes meeting hers. For the first time, she saw past the sorrow to the man beneath. She saw a profound exhaustion, but also a deep-seated decency that he fought to maintain against the weight of his own pain. "Thank you," he murmured. It was only 2 words, but in the profound silence of that house, it felt like a speech. She simply nodded and retreated to her room, the iron key feeling a little less heavy in her pocket. She was still a prisoner, in a way, a prisoner of her circumstances, of the world outside this small farm. But for the first time, she began to wonder if this place was not a cage, but a cocoon. The weeks bled into a month, and the fragile rhythm of their life solidified. The summer heat mellowed into the golden haze of early autumn. The corn in the field stood tall, and Seraphina's belly grew rounder, a constant, living promise of the future. The fear that had been her constant companion had receded, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. Trust was a seed that had been planted in barren soil, but against all odds, it was beginning to sprout, nurtured by the silent language of shared space and mutual respect. She learned the landscape of Elias's grief through the objects he kept. A faded daguerreotype on the mantelpiece showed a smiling young woman with his same stormy eyes, holding a baby, a much younger Caleb. On a small nail by the hearth hung a woman's sunbonnet, its ribbon frayed. He never spoke of her, but his late wife, Hannah, was a constant, gentle presence in the house. Seraphina respected that presence. She cleaned around the photograph, she never touched the bonnet. She understood that she was not a replacement, but a survivor, living in the space a great love had left behind. Elias, in turn, began to open up in small, nearly imperceptible ways. One evening, as a storm raged outside, trapping them all in the warm circle of the firelight, he spoke. "Hannah planted the roses by the porch," he said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the flames. "She said a place isn't a home without something that's beautiful for no reason." Seraphina looked out the window, where the thorny bushes were being lashed by the wind and rain. She had wondered about them, a splash of defiant beauty in such a practical place. "They're lovely," she replied softly. It was a simple exchange, but it felt monumental. He had shared a memory, a piece of his past, a piece of his Hannah. He was letting her in, just a crack. The next day, after the storm had passed and the world smelled clean and new, she found a rocking chair on the porch. Elias had brought it down from the barn loft. It was old and weathered, but he had sanded the arms smooth and tightened the joints. He didn't say a word, just nodded toward it as he left for the fields. It was an offering. A recognition of her condition, of her need for comfort. She spent her afternoons there, rocking gently, feeling the baby kick and turn inside her. Caleb would often sit on the steps nearby, chattering about his day, about a frog he'd found or the way the clouds looked like animals. He had accepted her presence completely. To him, she was simply Sarah, the woman who baked sweet bread and hummed soft tunes while she worked. She had become part of his world, filling a silence he hadn't even known how to name. The baby inside her was no longer a source of terror, but a deep, fierce joy. In the safety of this strange sanctuary, she allowed herself to love the child with an unguarded heart. She started to sew clothes for the infant from old flour sacks, her stitches small and neat. One evening, Elias watched her hands moving with the needle and thread. "My wife. Hannah, she was always making things," he said, his voice thick with memory. Her hands were never still. He reached for the tiny garment she was making. His large, rough fingers were surprisingly gentle as he touched the soft fabric. "Have you thought of a name?" he asked, the question hesitant. She looked up, surprised by the intimacy of the question. "If it's a girl, Hope," she said without thinking. The word hung in the air between them. Hope. It was what he had given her. It was what this place had given her. A fragile, audacious, and utterly precious thing. "And if it's a boy," he prompted softly. She smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I haven't decided." His gaze lingered on her face, and for a fleeting moment, the sorrow in his eyes was replaced by something warm, something that looked almost like peace. He was beginning to see her not just as a responsibility he had taken on, but as Seraphina. A woman of quiet strength and deep resilience. He saw the way she cared for Caleb, the way she had brought a gentle order back to his chaotic, grief-stricken home. He was a man who had sworn off feeling anything, who had buried his heart with his wife. But life, stubbornly, was pushing up through the frozen ground of his soul. The turning point came with the first chill of winter. Seraphina awoke one night with a sharp, wrenching pain in her abdomen. Fear, cold and immediate, seized her. It was too soon. She tried to stifle her gasp, but a second wave of pain forced a cry from her lips. Her door opened almost instantly. Elias stood there, silhouetted in the moonlight, his face etched with concern. "What is it?" "The baby," she breathed, clutching her stomach. Without a word, he was at her side. He lit a lamp, his hand steady despite the urgency of the moment. He sent Caleb, wide-eyed and scared, for fresh water. He tended to her with a calm competence that was profoundly reassuring. He brewed a special tea from herbs he kept in a tin, something his mother had taught him. He bathed her forehead with a cool cloth. He spoke to her in low, soothing tones, telling her it was just a false labor, that everything would be all right. He did not treat her like a burden, or a problem, or a piece of property. He treated her like a person he cared for. He sat in a chair by her bed all night, never leaving her side until the pain subsided with the dawn. As the morning sun streamed through the window, she awoke to find him asleep in the chair, his head slumped to one side, the carved wooden bird fallen from his lap onto the floor. In that unguarded moment, she saw the full depth of his exhaustion and his goodness. The wall she had kept around her heart, the last bastion of her fear and distrust, finally crumbled. When he stirred awake, he found her watching him, her eyes soft with an emotion he hadn't seen before. "Thank you, Elias," she whispered. He just nodded, his face shadowed with fatigue, but a new understanding passed between them. The lines had been redrawn. He was no longer just her protector, she was no longer just his ward. They were two people, bound by circumstance, who had found an unexpected harbor in one another. The peace was a fragile thing, a soap bubble shimmering in the autumn light, and they both knew, in the deepest parts of their souls, that it could not last. The world outside the boundaries of their small farm had not forgotten them. It was a predator, patient and circling, and one day, it arrived. It came not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet crunch of carriage wheels on the dirt road. Elias was mending a fence post at the edge of his property when he saw it, a black shape moving with deliberate speed, kicking up a plume of dust that seemed to poison the clean air. He froze, his hand tightening on his hammer. His blood ran cold. He had known this day might come. He had hoped, foolishly, that his isolation was a sufficient shield. The carriage was expensive, sleek and black as a raven's wing, pulled by two magnificent black horses. It was a symbol of a power and wealth that did not belong in this part of the country. It stopped a short distance from him. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a fine wool coat, despite the lingering warmth of the day. His face was handsome in a cruel, sharp way, with eyes as cold and grey as river stones. He moved with an unearned and absolute confidence, the predatory grace of a wolf entering a sheepfold. Elias knew, instinctively, who he was. This was the source of the shadows in Serafina's past. The man's eyes swept over the humble farm with a look of disdain before they settled on Elias. He smiled, a thin, unpleasant curving of the lips. "A quaint little plot you have here," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, but with an undercurrent of steel. A lot of work for one man and a boy. Elias did not answer. He stood his ground, his body a silent wall between this man and the house. The hammer in his hand felt heavy, inadequate. "I believe you have something of mine," the man continued, taking a step closer. He pulled a fine leather glove onto his hand, his movements leisurely, savoring the moment. "A piece of property that went missing from my estate some months ago. A female, with child." The air grew thick, charged with menace. The birds in the nearby trees fell silent. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. "Her name is Serafina. I am Silas Blackwood. And I've come to collect what is lawfully mine." Elias's jaw tightened, the muscles bunching. He thought of Serafina inside the house, safer now, rocking in the chair he had fixed for her, humming to the child within her. He thought of the hope he had seen blooming in her eyes, a fragile flower he had inadvertently nurtured. "There's no one here by that name," Elias said, his voice flat and hard as bedrock. Blackwood chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Let's not play games, farmer. I have papers. Bills of sale. Witnesses. The law is on my side. She is my property, as is the child she carries. I've come a long way for her. I don't intend to leave empty-handed." He took another step forward, his cold eyes scanning past Elias, toward the house. At that moment, the front door opened a crack. Serafina had heard the carriage. She peeked out, and her face went ashen. All the color drained from it, replaced by a stark, primal terror that Elias had not seen since the day of the auction. She vanished back inside, but it was too late. Blackwood had seen her. His smile widened. "Ah, there she is. Hiding, are we?" After all my generosity, he looked back at Elias, his demeanor shifting from veiled threat to open command. "Stand aside. I have no quarrel with you. Give me what's mine, and I will be on my way. I might even be inclined to forget that you've been harboring stolen goods inside the house." Seraphina's world had shattered. The sound of that voice, the sight of that face, threw her back into the darkness. Her hands flew to her belly, her only thought to protect her child. Caleb ran to her side, sensing her terror, and grabbed her hand, his small face a mask of fear and confusion. Elias did not move. He seemed to grow taller, more solid, rooted to the earth itself. The quiet, grieving farmer was gone. In his place stood something else, something harder and far more dangerous. The sorrow in his eyes was eclipsed by a cold, lethal resolve. It was the look of a man who had lost everything once and would die before he allowed it to happen again. "You're on my land," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "And you're not welcome here, your land." Blackwood scoffed. "This pathetic patch of dirt? The law, my friend, does not end at your fence line. There are other laws," Elias said, his eyes never leaving Blackwood's. Older ones. He took a deliberate step forward, shifting his weight. It was a subtle movement, but it spoke volumes. It was the posture of a fighter. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his arrogant features. He had expected a simple farmer, easily intimidated. He was facing something he did not recognize, a resolve as unyielding as the mountains on the horizon. "This is a mistake," Blackwood said, his voice losing some of its smooth confidence. "A very costly one. I will be back. And when I return, I will bring the full force of the law with me. You will not only lose the woman, you will lose this farm, your son, everything. You will be ruined." He held Elias's gaze for a long, tense moment, a silent battle of wills fought across a few yards of dusty ground. Then, with a final, contemptuous sneer, Blackwood turned, climbed back into his carriage, and was gone, leaving a trail of dust and a promise of violence hanging in the air. Elias stood watching until the carriage was a speck in the distance. The hammer felt slick in his sweating palm. He let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The quiet was over. The storm he had seen in the distance had finally arrived. He turned and walked back toward the house, his steps heavy. He was no longer just a farmer protecting a guest. He was a man defending his home, and the family he hadn't realized he had built. The silence that fell after Blackwood's departure was heavier and more suffocating than any that had come before. It was a silence filled with the echo of his threats and the certainty of his return. When Elias entered the cabin, he found Seraphina huddled by the cold hearth, her arms wrapped around Caleb, who was crying silently into her skirts. Her face was a mask of despair, the fragile hope of the past months utterly extinguished. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a terrifying resignation. "You should let him take me," she whispered, her voice broken. "He was right. He'll ruin you. He'll take everything. Your farm, your son." Elias crossed the room and knelt before her. He gently disentangled Caleb from her embrace and looked the boy in the eye. "Caleb, go to your room. Pack a small bag with your warmest clothes and the wooden bird. Then I need you to hide in the root cellar. Don't come out, no matter what you hear. Do you understand me?" No matter what. The boy's lip trembled, but he saw the iron command in his father's eyes. He nodded, wiped his tears, and did as he was told. He was his father's son, quiet and obedient in the face of crisis. Elias then turned his full attention to Seraphina. He took her hands in his. They were ice cold. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent, forcing her to meet his gaze. "He will not take you. He will not take your child. I will not let him." "You can't fight him," she sobbed, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling over. "He has money, the law, I told you," Elias interrupted, his grip on her hands tightening slightly, infusing her with his own strength. "There are other laws." He stood and went to a large, dusty wooden chest in the corner, one she had never seen him open. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside, beneath a layer of old blankets, lay the secrets of his past. There was a worn leather gun belt, the holster mold to the shape of a Colt revolver. Next to it lay a repeating rifle, its stock dark and oiled. He lifted the weapons out, his movements practiced and familiar. He was no farmer fumbling with a gun. He was a man reacquainting himself with old, deadly friends. This was the man who had survived something that had put the permanent sorrow in his eyes. A soldier, a lawman, something more. The question of his past was answered not with words, but with the grim efficiency of his actions. He strapped on the gun belt. It settled on his hips as if it had always belonged there. The quiet widower was gone, replaced by a sentinel. "He will come back before sundown," Elias said, checking the rifle's action with a sharp, metallic click. "He'll bring the county sheriff, a man named Brody. Brody's in his pocket. And a few other men he can hire for a day's wage." He looked at Serafina, his eyes intense. "I will not fail again." The words were heavy with the ghost of Hannah, of a promise he had made to her and been unable to keep. He was not just fighting for Serafina now, he was fighting for his own redemption. The afternoon light began to fade, casting long, menacing shadows across the yard. The farm, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Elias barricaded the front door with the heavy table. He checked the sightlines from the windows. He moved with a grim purpose that sent a fresh wave of fear through Serafina, but this fear was different. It was mingled with a fierce, protective awe. She would not let him face this alone. While he prepared for battle, she prepared for survival. She filled every bucket and pot with water. She gathered bandages from the linen chest. She took the remaining bread and meat and wrapped them, preparing provisions for a siege. Her fear was a fire in her veins, but it was a fire that forged resolve, not paralysis. She was no longer the helpless woman from the auction block. She was a mother protecting her young, a partner standing with her mate against the coming storm. As dusk settled, they came. For riders, dark silhouettes against the blood-red sunset. Blackwood was in the lead, with a portly man wearing a sheriff's star, and two rough-looking hired guns. They stopped just out of rifle range, a dark knot of impending violence. "Elias Thorne," the sheriff yelled, his voice carrying on the still evening air. "This is Sheriff Brody. You are harboring a fugitive slave. Come out with your hands empty and turn her over." Elias moved to the window, the rifle cradled in his arms. "She's a free woman on my land, Brody. You know Blackwood's claim is worthless here. Turn around and ride away." Blackwood spurred his horse forward. "The talking is over, Thorne. Send her out, or we'll burn you out." The first shot came from one of the hired guns, splintering the window frame next to Elias's head. The battle had begun. The next few minutes were a blur of sound and fury. The roar of rifles, the shattering of glass, the angry whine of bullets tearing through wood. Elias was a phantom, moving from window to window, never offering a clean target. His shots were not wild, they were precise, controlled. He didn't aim to kill, but to disable. A shot kicked up dirt in front of a horse, sending it rearing and throwing its rider. Another shattered the stock of the second gunman's rifle, rendering it useless. Inside, Serafina kept low, her heart pounding in time with the gunshots. She heard a cry of pain from outside. Then another. Elias was a whirlwind of disciplined violence, a force of nature unleashed. Sheriff Brody, a coward at heart, had no stomach for a real fight. When a bullet from Elias's rifle tore his hat from his head, he yelped in terror, wheeled his horse, and fled back down the road he came. The two hired guns, one disarmed, one nursing a wounded arm, quickly followed suit. Only Blackwood remained, his face a mask of incandescent rage. He was alone, his authority stripped, his power revealed as hollow. He drew his own pistol and charged toward the house on horseback, screaming in fury. Elias stepped out onto the porch, his revolver in hand, standing exposed. It was a final, stark challenge. Man to man. Blackwood fired wildly, the bullet thudding into the timber of the house. Elias stood firm, raised his pistol, took careful aim, and fired once. The shot was perfect. It struck Blackwood in the shoulder, not killing him, but sending him tumbling from his horse into the dust. He lay on the ground, groaning, his fine coat stained with dirt and blood, his reign of terror over. Silence descended once more, broken only by Blackwood's pathetic moans. Elias walked slowly toward him, his face grim. He kicked the pistol away from Blackwood's reach. The fight was done. The threat was neutralized. Seraphina rushed out onto the porch. Her eyes met Elias's across the yard. In that one look, everything that had been unspoken between them was finally said. Relief, gratitude, and a love forged in the crucible of shared struggle. Then she saw the dark stain spreading across the side of Elias's shirt. He had been hit. He swayed on his feet, the rifle clattering to the ground as he crumpled to his knees. The adrenaline that had sustained him fled, and the pain took its place. She ran to him, her own fear forgotten, her only thought for the man who had risked everything for her. She knelt in the dust beside him, her hands hovering over his wound, her tears finally falling, not for herself, but for him. She had found her home, and she would not lose it now. The night was long. After binding Blackwood's hands and leaving him tied and groaning by the road for whatever justice might find him, Seraphina helped Elias back into the house. The bullet had torn through the flesh of his side. It was a deep, ragged wound, bleeding sluggishly. She laid him on his own bed, the first time she had ever entered his private space. The room was even sparer than the rest of the house, dominated by the large bed and the single, faded photograph of Hannah and Caleb on the nightstand. With a deep breath, she pushed aside the feeling of being an intruder and became a healer. She sent a trembling but resolute Caleb to fetch the whiskey and her sewing kit. She washed the wound with a tenderness that belied the gruesome task, her touch gentle on his feverish skin. He gritted his teeth against the pain, his face pale in the lamplight. His eyes, clouded with pain, never left her face. He was watching her, entrusting himself to her care just as she had entrusted herself to him. "The bullet's still in there," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "It has to come out." He just nodded, his jaw tight. What followed was an act of supreme trust. With Elias's clasp knife, sterilized in the flame of the lamp, she probed for the bullet, her hands guided by a desperate prayer. He did not cry out, but a low groan escaped his lips, and his hand clenched the bedsheets until his knuckles were white. She worked with a focused intensity, her fear transformed into a fierce determination. Finally, her knife scraped against metal. With a final, agonizing push, she pried the misshapen piece of lead free. It fell into the basin with a small clatter. The worst was over. She poured whiskey into the clean wound, earning a sharp hiss of breath from him, then stitched the skin together with neat, even sutures, her sewing skills repurposed for this vital task. She bandaged him tightly with strips of clean linen. When it was done, she collapsed into the chair by the bed, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. Caleb, who had watched the entire ordeal with a silent, horrified bravery, crept to her side and laid his head in her lap. She stroked his hair, comforting him even as her own heart hammered in her chest. For the rest of the night, she sat vigil, bathing Elias's forehead when the fever took hold, giving him sips of water, and whispering reassurances into the dark. She was no longer his guest, his ward, or his responsibility. She was his partner. She had fought for him, healed him, and claimed her place by his side. In the grey light of dawn, his fever broke. He opened his eyes, and they were clear. He looked at her, then at his bandaged side, then at Caleb asleep on the floor with his head in her lap. "Sarah," he whispered, her name on his lips a soft prayer. He reached out and his hand covered hers. His touch was weak, but it was full of a profound, unspoken gratitude. "You saved me, you saved us," she corrected, her voice thick with emotion. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet healing. The rhythm of the farm returned, but it was different now. It was the rhythm of a family. While Elias recovered, Seraphina and Caleb ran the household. She taught the boy how to cook and mend, and he showed her the best places to find wild herbs. The silence between her and Elias was no longer one of tension or uncertainty, but of comfortable, shared intimacy. He would watch her from his bed, his eyes following her as she moved about the cabin, a soft smile touching his lips. One afternoon, as she sat rocking on the porch, her time near, he came out and stood before her, leaning on a makeshift crutch. He was holding the small, carved wooden bird. "I carved this for Hannah," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "The day Caleb was born. I wanted to give her something as beautiful and as free as she was." He held it out to Seraphina. "She would have wanted you to have it. She would have loved you." The declaration, so simple and so profound, was everything. It was an acceptance, a blessing, a passing of the torch. Seraphina took the bird, her fingers closing around the smooth wood. "Elias," she began, but he silenced her by gently placing a finger on her lips. "I know," he said. A few days later, her labor began. It was a swift, powerful storm, but this time there was no fear. Elias was by her side, his hand holding hers, his presence a rock of support. With the rising of the sun, a new cry filled the small cabin. A healthy baby girl, with a tuft of dark hair and her mother's resilient spirit. They named her Hope. Months later, the farm was transformed. The roses Hannah had planted were in full, glorious bloom. The sound of a baby's laughter mingled with the happy chatter of a young boy. The house felt full, alive. One evening at twilight, Elias, Seraphina, Caleb, and baby Hope stood on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky was awash in brilliant pinks and purples, a painter's masterpiece. Elias's arm was wrapped securely around Seraphina's shoulders, and she leaned into his strength. Caleb stood between them, holding his new sister's tiny hand. They were a portrait of a family forged not by blood, but by courage, kindness, and a love that had bloomed in the most desolate of soils. The dust of that land remembered it all. It remembered the auction and the fear, the silence and the sorrow. But now, it also remembered the laughter, the healing, and the quiet joy of this small, unlikely family. They became a kind of legend in that sparse country, a story whispered from one generation to the next. The story of the silent, grieving widower who bought a woman at auction not to be his slave, but to be his wife, and who found in her the redemption of his own broken heart. They had built their home on a foundation of hope, and in the wild, unforgiving heart of the plains, they had found their peace.